Quite a provocative title, right? CDNs are dead. It is really about CDNs as we know it is coming to an end, right? With the rise of the edge. So we'll spend a bit of time elaborating on what we mean by that. So Ericsson UDN is sort of a global service provider integrated network that is aspiring to revolutionize and rethink the way content delivery or any type of delivery of a digital service is being done from a deployment, from an architecture, from a business model perspective. We'll spend some time to elaborate on what edge means, right? So edge, I think, is probably one of the most misused and used words in the industry today. I actually went in on PitchBook and searched the word edge, and it's 766 startups a day that have edge in it, right? So it's a lot of people that claim to do edge, but what does edge really mean, you know? So we'll elaborate a bit on that. So from an agenda perspective, go through some of the big trends, many of you are probably familiar with them. Defining the edge, what does the edge mean? And how do I see that we define the edge? What does the next generation content delivery ecosystem look like? And actually, what does the next generation, not just content delivery ecosystem, but delivery of any type of digital service look like? What new business opportunities does that open up? And some conclusions. I will leave about 5 to 10 minutes of questions in the end. So please write them down, and let's have an interactive session at the end of the presentation. So as many of you probably are aware, right, if you look at the CDN market, if you're just thinking just purely CDN, there is a accelerated price erosion on price per gigabit delivered, right? At the same time, we see data exploding, and it's all type of workloads. Media, of course, being the main driver, and video being the main driver. But we also see new type of workloads, right? The workloads that require lower latency, more proximity to the end user. That requires compute at the edge, which is a total game changer, right? Because now it's just not just optimizing for downstream bit delivery. It's also about how you're actually going to handle the upstream and where you're going to put compute and how you're going to handle the whole data modeling around it, right? And you have IoT coming in as a buzzword that we're very eager to tie on to our CDN story, right? But what does it actually mean, and what are the requirements of IoT, and how does a CDN, as it stands today, or as it stands in the future, fits into that? Then we have the end user, right? I mean, the millennials and ourselves that are increasingly expecting a higher QoE or QoS, that is expecting lower loading times, higher quality in terms of the bit rate, and also expecting everything to be free. But I see on the agenda probably other sessions to discuss about that. And at the same time, you have the very enablers of this ecosystem, right? The one who are forced to invest in the infrastructure, which is the service providers. And I know we have a few of you here. The service providers, whether it's fixed or mobile, see all this traffic going over the network, and they see all this revenue being generated over the top. But at the same time, it's not being shared with them, right? But so they are in this peculiar situation, and we have this very interesting imperfection in the ecosystem where the very enablers of the ecosystem are forced to invest without participating in the value creation. And this is, I think, or we think from Ericsson UDN, it's an unsustainable situation where we are faced with an imperfect ecosystem and an unbalanced value chain when it comes to content distribution. So we just elaborate quickly, and this is very familiar for most of you here, but if you just think about the evolution of CDN, and think about the evolution of CDN in the context of the amount of services a CDN was expected to support, right? It started off with loading web pages faster, and then video came in, and DDoS, right? But if you look at where CDN is expected to participate and the services it is expected to be delivering at a high quality, always available, right? I mean, we can call it telco grade, broadcast scale, broadcast grade. It's increasingly becoming more and more, right? And as I said earlier, we have these new workloads coming in. So what does this mean for the infrastructure? What does this mean for how you architect your software? What does this mean for how and where you deploy your servers and your service? And I think that's some of the things that we will elaborate on now for a few for a few slides. So if you start off with the sort of technology evolution, right? It started off with the fact that if you're deploying a new service, you deployed a new set of hardware, and you optimized your deployment for that specific service, right? So you ended up with all these vertical stacks, vertical hardware pools, optimized to support whether it's HTTPS or whether it's support ABR, whatever it is, right? Somewhere around along the road, we realized that, okay, hey, this actually benefits in virtualizing and decoupling the physical infrastructure from the service infrastructure. But at the same time, we're deploying this in a carrier-neutral, central location somewhere, right? So even though we realize that partly we need to virtualize our infrastructure, and if you look across the spectrum of players, the virtualization has happened in different stages. Some are fully virtualized, the ones that are coming into the market today, whereas some are struggling with a legacy architecture, right? I mean, coming from Ericsson and looking at how we're trying to virtualize our own network functions, I can tell you that if you haven't built it for virtualization or cloud native from the beginning, it's extremely hard to just take something and just put it in the cloud because you don't really get the scales and the benefits of it. And then you think about, okay, what does the stack need to look like for the new services that we're starting to see? Can you run an IoT workload? Can you run an AR, VR, 4K, 8K workload on the same type of infrastructure that you deployed in the early 2000s, right? Can you run it on the same type of software architecture that you optimized for downstream VOD delivery? And I think that is really the question. And so let's look at IoT, right? I think IoT is probably one of the more, outside of security, probably one of the more popular bolt-on things that we as CDNs say that this is a future revenue opportunity for us. So if you just look at, okay, very, very objectively map out what does the full delivery chain look like? Because if you talk about IoT, unless it is a smart home where you're connected to a router, or even in a fixed access environment, you will have the core aggregation site and the access point, right? And just inherently, if you look at all the hops you need to take in the network to connect an end-user device, whether it's to fixed network or to a wireless network, the hops are typically 6 to 12 hops in the network before you reach your server where you can actually start doing compute. And I'm talking about this not in a 5G world, but just in generic, because today we cannot virtualize the core and the access network. 5G talks about making that a reality, and we'll elaborate a bit on that later. But just as a statement is, the device is usually at a fair amount of distance from where the intelligence sits, right? You could try to put a Raspberry Pi close to the device and put some sort of intelligence in the device. But if you think about from a financial perspective, the scalability of that model is not really feasible, right? I mean, if you think in a global multi-billion device ecosystem, to have all that intelligence sitting in the device is not really a sustainable model, right? And as applications become more and more time sensitive, there is an estimation by several players in the market that about 10% of all IoT applications in the future will be time sensitive. So let's elaborate a bit about what time sensitive means. So time sensitive means it has different meanings for different types of applications, right? If you think of an AR, VR scenario, at least at VR, there is very strict latency requirements to avoid nausea, right? If you have too much latency and you have too much unsync between the frames when you're moving around, you will get nauseous, right? So there is very heavy latency requirements. The same thing for augmented reality when you're going to use it in mission-critical applications. It's also very bandwidth intensive. Talk about 4K, 8K video, it's more still our traditional, what we know, CDN, downstream bit delivery, but with much higher bandwidth requirements. Live video, as I see on the agenda, we'll talk a lot about live event and the challenges of live video. And then you have IoT, right? I mean, if you talk about a smart metering sitting in a house that just needs to send upstream data once a month to read the meters, not very latency sensitive. when you start talking about an autonomous car, super latency sensitive, right? So it's not all applications will need to be at the edge, but I think we can all conclude that some applications will benefit from being run at the edge and not being run in a central data center somewhere. So the question that I asked myself a few years back was, does the edge matter? I think it do, and I sure hope it does. Otherwise, I think maybe some of us need to find a new job. But I think that's a fact that we're seeing, and we're also seeing a lot of players moving in to the edge. So that was just sort of me reflecting on some of the background and some of the requirements. If you start thinking about what do you, as an infrastructure, or as a CDN, or any type of cloud provider, need to think about when it comes to addressing these emerging services? I think the first thing you need to think about is the proximity to the end user, to move close to the user and the device. And for me, proximity is not just like physically being close. It's also it's a placement in the network, whether it's a fixed or a wireless network. It's how close you are, how many hops you are away from the end device. Right? Sometimes we mistake proximity to physical proximity, but it's really about how close you are in the network. Right? I think that's the first thing that we really need to address. The second thing is I call infrastructure organization. I think we CDN, we pride ourselves with being infrastructure organizations. When you start thinking about deploying other type of applications, there are very different requirements when it comes to self-provisioning, automation, self-service, etc. So there is a redefinition of what an infrastructure organization means. We also need to think of the world in a demand-based model, right? Today, or up until now, the world has been fairly predictive, right? It's video delivery, so we know what type of service the end user will request. So we optimize our infrastructure and our architecture to support that service. Going forward, I think we'll see a much more of a demand-based model where we don't really know which application is going to take off first when it comes to edge compute, right? Is this going to be autonomous driving? Is this going to be autonomous drones? Whatever it's going to be. But we need to have an organization and an infrastructure that's able to support the demand side and not being a supply side. And then the fourth thing is really about, we are, as CDNs, very good at distributing our infrastructure to deliver, but now we need to rethink, what does this mean when we're going to distribute other type of services and application at the same scale, right? It's fundamentally different how you model your data, how you think about service orchestration when you're deploying applications on a global distributed scale versus delivering video on a global distributed scale. So those are some of the things that I'm going to elaborate on now. So first, let's tackle the million-dollar question, or probably the billion-dollar question. Where is the edge? I define the edge as latency, right? Because the edge, just because you are in a central office, doesn't mean you're at the edge. It depends completely of how you're connected, where you're processing, and what's the way the device is connected to the network, right? If it's connected to a fixed network and you're in a central office somewhere, you need to backhaul all the way down into the wireless network, or you're at the edge. No, I would say you're not, right? So for me, I define the edge as latency. And if you think about what we talked about earlier, the latency requirements of some of these applications, I think it's just a fact that if you're going to support real-time IoT application or any type of application that's extremely latency sensitive or time sensitive, you have to be deployed at the aggregation of the access network, whether it's a fixed or a mobile operator. That's just a fact. And if you look at some of these numbers, I mean, of course, it differs if you are in metropolitan Frankfurt versus rural India, right? But as a baseline, I think we can all, or I'm at least making the statement that to deploy something at the edge, you need to be within 10 to 20 milliseconds latency runtime, right? And if you think about this in not just a downstream scenario, you think about this in an interactive scenario that will require processing at some point, then the latency requirements are being amplified, right? Because For every time you're having an interaction between your server and the end device, you will have a runtime, right? And think in a self-driving car scenario, right? Or a AR scenario. I think Pokemon was the first application that really showed us the vulnerability of an access network or a mobile network when it comes to request-heavy applications that require low latency. The second thing that we touched upon earlier was the way in which you envision your architecture, right? CDN, typically, you build a vertically optimized, integrated stack for delivering media, right? When you start thinking about the other type of applications and the requirements they have, and I'm not talking about autonomous driving, I'm just thinking about deploying the next live synchronous OTT application that's using a UDP-based protocol. Right? How quick can you as a CDN spin that up and be live? Like, what do you need to do to your infrastructure to support something? What do you need to do to your HTTP infrastructure to support a high throughput UDP-based use case and a UDP-based application? If you think about how a central cloud would do it, they would just spin up the resources you need, and they would use it not in a VM-like environment. They will think in a containerized environment, right? Where you in the container define what you need from the network, what you need from all the different layers below layer 7. And it's all zero touch, right? I mean, it's all a portal. It's all self-service. And I think this is fundamentally different for how we think about things in CDN. Right? Some CDNs, of course, are better than others. But it's a mindset shift, how we structure the organization, how we architect the software, and also how we deploy and how we logically arrange our hardware pools out there. So for a CDN, I think what we really need to do is to start decoupling the edge CDN part of delivery from the platform piece, right? Because you cannot build a stack optimized for a use case and then force another application to use that same optimized stack. So I think it's a mindset of decoupling CDN as an application from the underlying infrastructure. And remember, I'm not talking about optimizing just bit delivery. I'm talking about if CDN is going to survive in capturing these new revenue streams that are coming out there, whether it's IoT or edge cloud or whatever we call them. You need to have a fundamentally different mindset in terms of how you view your CDN solution and application. I mean, you still need, from the edge delivery side, a global deep footprint inside an operator's network. It can't be in a neutral facility. But you also need to have an underlying platform that has all the characteristics of automation, self-provisioning, and be able to support a multiple of different applications. Another statement that I would like to make is, if you think about compute at the edge, right? We talk about having just 4 data centers in North America is probably enough for media delivery, right? I mean, you'll probably get down to 30 milliseconds, 35 milliseconds downstream bit delivery by having 4 major data centers with the right peering relationships in US, which has a fairly developed infrastructure from coast to coast. But if you think about when we talk about sub 10 millisecond and the distribution you need and the footprint you need at a global scale, deep in operator's network, it doesn't only become financially impractical, but also becomes just time-wise impractical to build that out yourself, right? I mean, if you're going to build out thousands of small compute pops across the globe with GPUs, TPUs, or what have you, in order to support the new workloads, what would that cost? I mean, I know there are companies out there that financially have the muscles to do it, but just the time it would take to do it, right? So the way that I see, the only way to really be successful in this new ecosystem with these new requirements is through partnerships. And remember early on in the presentation, I talked about the imperfect value chain, right? And the broken ecosystem of where service providers were not included in the delivery chain. I think in the US, it's probably one of the countries where it's better than others. But if you think about it from a global perspective as well, if you do not incentivize the service provider through partnership to participate in the delivery chain, why would they help you to optimize the delivery of the end user? Right? From an application developer perspective, the service provider network and the last mile network has really been a black box. You don't really know what's going on in it. You don't really have access to the service providers. Because being Ericsson, we love the service providers, but they're very big, so it's hard to find the right person. So it's just been sort of a CDN has been a guy in the middle, sort of shielding both sides from each other and optimizing for itself. But in the new, I think, and that has worked for CDN because of the peer relationship. But as we move into the new era of CDN, or edge cloud, or edge computing, or whatever we'll call it, it will require a completely new type of collaborative approach. And you see the service providers at the same time also looking for new revenue opportunities, looking for being included in the OTT ecosystem. And they are really eager to participate because you think from a global scale and the footprint they have deployed, at an aggregated scale, they are hyper-relevant. But typically in their own local domain, they are subscale, right? Because what has happened in the last 10 years is the definition of scale has been drastically redefined. If you had 15, 20, 30 million subscribers 10, 15 years ago, you had scale. Today, you're nothing, right? In a web scale environment, unless you're 500 million, 1 billion users, you don't have scale. So the way we envision the next generation media delivery platform is really about by including the service provider in the value chain, rethinking how you deploy and how you architect not only just your application, but also your underlying platform. You come to something that looks like this, right? If you just from an edge computing and sort of at the end of the spectrum perspective, you should have the ability not to just deploy CDN as an application, but you should have the underlying infrastructure capabilities of deploy any type of application. I mean, it could be video related, but you should not have to do anything to your underlying infrastructure, whether it's UDP-based, RTMP, HTTP, or whether it's a synchronous live application that require real-time interaction between the client and the server. You also need to be able to expose the data from this. Today, the last mile network from a service provider perspective, from a content provider perspective, is a black box, as I said earlier, right? So how are you able to expose that data and the analytics of what's going on in the last mile and how your application is behaving? You see a lot of companies out there, a lot of startups from the Valley that have as their prime mission to expose what's going on in the last mile, right? They're shipping devices to across the globe, placing them in different access service providers' network, and then allowing you to deploy your application on these mobile devices just to see how it's behaving, and they are skyrocketing, right, these companies. At the same time, from a content provider perspective, there's a lot of services that has been built into the service provider network that could be used by a content provider, right? And you think about, toll-free media delivery, multicast, not just multicast in the fixed network, but multicast in the radio access network, which is LTE broadcast. Setting QoS parameters to make sure that you find the best optimized path through the access network without sort of going into net neutrality. There's ways that if you include a service provider in the delivery chain and they see the workload coming, they can at least make sure that you're not hitting a congested route. And this is, from a CDN perspective, this is a mind shift of how you deploy, how you build, architect, and design your software, but also a completely different mindset in how you construct your business model. Because there's one thing to deploy your servers in a colo facility of a service provider, right? I mean, they have a bunch of different third-party servers in there. But if you're going to go in and deploy your virtualized cache in a 5G access or 5G fixed network, I can tell you there would be very different requirements on security, on how you build and how you monitor, and the different level of trust and incentive a service provider need in order to let you in there. So I think we're coming to a crossroad where I've spoken to a lot of service providers across the globe, and they really feel that as they virtualize their networks and open up for the capabilities of other type of applications being deployed this deep into the network, they will require a completely different level of collaboration in the industry for all of us to take advantage of that. So if you think about the new business opportunities and what the new value chain would look like, right? As a service provider today, you're only really in the connectivity and the bandwidth part of the ecosystem, and you're getting paid per gigabyte from a peering relationship at a best effort agreement in general cases, right? But if you think about the future and where the benefits of including the service providers in the other aspects of the value chain and the benefits to the content provider and the application owner of doing so, I think we're starting to see a reality where we actually can start deploy low latency IoT applications at a virtualized access network, or deploy 4K and 8K video with high reliability, because it's not just about delivering the first stream with good quality, it's also about the availability of resources, right? And the financials behind providing all those resources yourself. So it's really about repositioning, recreating, and rebuilding the value chain of the delivery ecosystem of tomorrow. And once we've done that, and once we figure that out, and once we have that mindset in mind, then we can start talking about immersive AR, VR, industrial IoT, smart city security, what have you, right? But before we fundamentally can rethink, how we build, how we architect, how we deploy, where we deploy, and how we construct our business model, these will all be buzzwords that we can talk about, we can't really realize. So the point of our presentation, and not to say that CDNs are dead, is just to say that CDNs need to reinvent themselves or die. And as always, you need to put in some marketing, right? So UDN, as I'm heading up, we're all about aggregating the service provider edge, creating a global service provider network with deep footprint, deep network, deep distribution, with a new business model to really expose all of these services to the content world and the application world. And I would be very happy to talk about that in the break. And I know I'm probably cutting my presentation short, but that leaves a lot of room for a Q&A. So thank you.
Questions? I have a question for you.
Yes.
So a couple of years ago, the Verizon salesman came to our office and started talking about multi-CDN and CDXs. And so we implemented CDXs. We have about 5 CDNs. Depending on where the user is, he gets a different CDN in the world. And of course, I have a big problem of empty cache. And then I look at the competition, and a lot of these guys are migrating to Amazon Web Services. They can use what is it called again? CloudFront. And you see people like Comcast offering a CDN of their own and saying, whenever it's in the Comcast footprint, it's going to be the fastest, less hops. Where does this fit in this multi-CDN versus just going to Amazon versus just doing a deal with that service provider and switching to, if the customer's on Comcast footprint, just give it to Comcast. Where does this product fit in, this Ericsson product fit in?
So I think it's a good question. If we just tackle, because I think it's a different answer from Comcast versus CloudFront. I think where CloudFront has done a very good job is the whole automation, right? If you think about how easy it is to use CloudFront today, it doesn't even feel like you're using a CDN, right? It's just you're buying egress capacity out of EC2 or S3, right? So they've done a very good job on the one side of the spectrum that I'm discussing, sort of the technology stack, right? The ease of using and the ease of provisioning. But if you think about their distribution footprint, right? Again, I don't believe that as we talk about the super latency sensitive applications, you cannot deploy those in a central cloud, right? You need to deploy them deeper into the network, right? So we are not really, so where we are from a Amazon and CloudFront perspective, we are much more distributed, right? We are architecting and building our software with the same self-service mindset, but deeper distributed, right? There will still be a lot of application and workloads that should be run in a central cloud that should not move to the edge, which is fine, right? I think the central cloud compute market and that race, I think AWS or Azure have won that, and I don't think we don't have any ambitions to go in and play there. We're more going into the edge and understanding what applications, or maybe extending their workloads deeper into the edge. From a Comcast perspective, this is where the partnership model comes in, right? As you say that you have 5 CDNs, right? But if you're gonna integrate to each CDN, because every service provider in the world basically have their own CDN. Either they bought it from Ericsson or Nokia or Cisco or Huawei or whoever, right? And then Comcast built their own, right? ATS. So our vision is we would integrate into Comcast. We are extending, we're exposing the Comcast network as a capability into the UDN. We're not about building it ourselves. We're more of a, in your multi-CDN scenario, more of a distributed multi-CDN globally, but we're distributed deep into the operator's network, not distributed to the 5 other CDNs, if that makes sense.
So I think you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about the security issues of trying to get into areas like the RAM and the deep edge of the network. And from personal experience, I've seen over the last decade or so, we've been pushing that kind of technology down into the telco. The telco is very, very resistant to that change at this stage. My gut feeling personally is that we're kind of waiting for 5G to happen for that to really turn, to open that environment for deep edge applications to be offered by third parties in the service provider environment. Which means that I think for the next 12 to 24 months, I think that there's going to be a hiatus while CDNs are trying to offer that technology out. Obviously, you guys are having some success, but I suppose my question is, do you think that this is something that's actually an open market yet, or do you think we've got another 12 to 24 months to wait before we can start seeing operators able to run third-party applications?
I think it's, the answer is twofold. I think today, if you look at where most CDNs are deployed, it could still be deeper. I mean, you're outside of the firewall, you're outside of the sort of the peering point. So we see, at least because we're deploying deeper than that, that there is a market for being deployed deeper. But the trust that's being required and the incentives for a service provider to do so, because just paying for peering into their network, I mean, it's a completely different division of the service provider. It's a wholesale enterprise part of the service provider, and they are coin operated, right? So they will never allow you. So yes, I think there's a market today, or I know there is one, but you need to rethink the way you incentivize service providers. On the other hand side, when you talk about going deep edge, I think it's as much as the access network is not virtualized or modular enough for you to be able to deploy third-party applications today. Right? That's what 5G brings the promise of. Today, you can only go as far out as the IP port will let you, which is typically not as far out. You cannot run other workloads than 3GPP on a baseband. But with 5G, you will be able to. So, but again, it comes into the fact, so because our whole sort of partnership model is based on service provider participation, the requirements that the service provider will put on you as a aggregator like ourselves or any type of application in terms of security, reliability, et cetera, is going to be very different than what we're used to in the internet world. Because if you think about it, remember, a telco is coming from the telco grade, right? We're talking about 5 nines, 6 nines, always high availability, right? That's their mindset. And we're thinking about like the internet world where everything always breaks, and we're trying to engineer and architect for the fact that things always break, right? So there's this clash of cultures where as a content provider, as a CDN, or as a platform provider, we need to understand that, but also we need to incentivize them, because I've heard, and I'm going to quote one one of the more forward-thinking service providers, they said that they're drawing a line in the sand, right? They've let people into their colo facilities, but that's where the line is drawn. If you're going to go deeper into the 5G access network, whether it's mobile or fixed, you will have to have a completely different incentive model and a completely different level of cooperation, because now you're touching their main business. Like, we had to remember CDN, I mean, these are multi-billion-dollar companies, right? And we're coming and saying, hey, I mean, you can get a couple of 10, 15, $20 million if you participate in the global OTT ecosystem at start, right? I mean, they're never going to take that risk unless you understand what it looks like on their side. So I think it's sort of twofold.
Any other questions?
I wonder if you could go a little deeper into the pitch part of your presentation and give us some sense of what Ericsson's bringing to the table in all this. You mentioned you're facing with something like a Comcast CDN where they're using their own internal software solutions, the large major, to handle all the processing and what have you. So one question is, to what degree does your software running on the CDNs of your partners interface easily in that conglomerate that isn't just your software? But also, what are the things that you're putting on the table to differentiate or make the CDNs that are operating through your partnership measure up to all the things you're talking about?
All right. So if I start with the first part. So we have 3 deployment models. One of the deployment model is the one that I mentioned with Comcast or any other third-party CDN, where we have a service exposure and service negotiation layer, where we basically, so the same way we would integrate into a Limelight or any of the other big CDNs, we would integrate into a Comcast CDN, where we'll have API-based version for purge, log analytics, service activation, etc. So that's the way we interface. Every time we go to a service provider, I'm not coming and selling something. And basically, my goal is to help them monetize their existing assets, because I see a tremendous value in the footprint that service providers have deployed across the globe. It just needs to be aggregated and exposed in an easy way in one single, so one-stop shop to the application world. Right? I think there's this disconnect in their usability, right? I think that's how we would interact. How we would differentiate, I think the differentiation would be different if you think about today and you think about in the near-term future and you think about going forward. Today, in many of our deployments, we deploy deeper into the network than the other incumbents that are already in there, which means that we're getting and seeing a higher degree of performance due to that deeper network deployment. The second thing is we know, so Ericsson knows mobile networks very well. I think that's something that we can pride ourselves, even though we are Swedish, we don't like to brag, but we do know mobile networks. So there are many things that we can do, like LTE broadcast, setting QoS parameters in the access network to guarantee the performance, because it's actually delivering over a mobile network is one of the sort of few stops that hasn't really been solved in my mind. But also, if you think about 5G, especially in the US, it's just around the corner, right? And a virtualized 5G infrastructure and how that behaves in a virtualized core network is very different than how a centralized virtualized compute infrastructure behaves. So if you're going to deploy your cache on a 5G radio bed or a 5G core, that needs deep understanding of how an access network behaves, like how you decouple the control plane versus the data plane, and where does it live. And that we know, right? So going forward, as the networks evolve, that's also how we see ourselves differentiating, right? Because we're already now running our cache in our own 5G test beds. Unfortunately, Ericsson will not be the only 5G provider in the world, but maybe, who knows, maybe Trump bans Huawei and ZTE, and everyone from the world. So, but yeah. Go on back there.
Sorry if I may have missed something, but I was going to ask it anyway. It may pertain to that question over there. And I see the Ericsson UDN and what you're talking about is somewhat of almost a brokerage kind of system. But in the case where two service providers have some overlapping footprints, and in the case where you have multi-CDN, there's some load balancing that goes on. UDN offer a load balancing function in those cases, or how is that treated?
Yes, we do. So we basically all the assets in our network are exposed through a portal, and we would direct. So if we're delivering to a person in New York, we would be delivering through either a partner here, which is a Northeast Telco, or any of the third-party CDNs that we have signed up, and we would use we would basically target the best delivery mechanism. And that's also, I mean, when we go to service provider and sign them up for this, we are crystal clear, right? We're not going to prioritize anyone based on relationship. The best performing network path will be the one that we use to serve.
And is that based on Sodexo's data, or Team data, or your own data?
So multiple data sources. Yeah.
You mentioned multiple data sources. What type of data? You don't have to tell us what they are, but what type of data sources are they?
So the traditional ones, like the one that you just mentioned, but also there is real-time information you can get from the network to understand where you have congestion. You can actually predict where you will have congestion. So there's a lot of data that sits in the mobile access network and the fixed networks that can be used to optimize delivery.
Are you using crowdsourced data or client data or browser or some type of browser tag, JavaScript or something of that nature?
Yes.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, once again for Marcus, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it.